The Babylon Project was our last best hope for Scott. A self-contained podcast, 1 hour long, located on the internet. A place of fun and discussion for Babylon 5 fans everywhere. A shining beacon in cyberspace, all alone in the night. It was the dawn of the 20th anniversary of Babylon 5, the year the Great War to free Bab 5 came upon us all. This is the story of the last of the Babylon podcasts. The year is 2014. The name of the place is the Babylon Project Podcast. Now, the host of the Babylon Project podcast, Jim Arrowwood and Raul Wybera.
Hi there. Thank you, Anthea, for that wonderful introduction. How are you doing there tonight, Jim?
Oh, doing well. Busier than heck, but getting through it, surviving.
You know, one of the things that we've talked about on and off as we've been doing these first couple of episodes is all of the good stuff that we've missed that I really wish we had on tape, or you really wish we had on tape while we were doing it. So we're going to take a little more conversational this time and start the recording a little right up front with a little less freeform, a little less.
Yes.
So.
No more talking about the episode before we talk about the episode.
Before we talk about the episode, exactly. Now, it's one of those things we learn over time. So what has your life been like?
Oh, well, we're coming to the end of school as we record this. This will be released a bit after that. And the schedule is not slowing down at all. Track meets, commencement, concerts, contests. It's been crazy. So I've been pretty busy.
Yeah, and at my end, I know some of the folks who've been waiting for us to get the podcast live have been wondering what's been going on. And
yes,
it's been a case. I've had some illnesses in the family that have really pulled a lot of my time. My mom, now that spring's here with my dad passing last summer, I've been pulled in with a lot of help getting things in order for her. She's fairly old now. And we've been selling off a piece of our company. So that's where a lot of the technical issues have come from on my side. And all I know is I'm excited to get the thing live out there for people. I know there's too many people who've been wanting to listen to us.
Oh, that's true. Anthony Dix over in Wales has been asking me, every few days, when are you going to release? And I can't say it's a competing podcast, but a friend of mine who is doing another podcast, it's called White Star 5. Rick is wanting us to start recording and getting things out so he doesn't have to watch the episode so he can do his podcast.
And, you know, the biggest sword over our heads is we've got Scott Herzog watching Babylon 5 now, finally, from what I understand.
Yes, as a matter of fact. He
said he started.
I listened today, and he has watched The Gathering, and he has watched at least the first episode. And Miles has it ordered on Netflix.
Oh, my, that's great. That's great. By the way, speaking of Scott and Miles, did you hear we are now for our Babylon 5 Hijack, we are now the third most downloaded show.
Yes, I did hear
on the
that.
Sci-Fi Diner.
I did hear that.
Totally blown away. And, folks, we're talking about other podcasts right now instead of our own, but Scott and Miles and the Diner and Em, we owe a lot because they're the ones, and it was the response that hijack got that really kicked us off for this.
I owe a great deal to the Diner simply because they inspired me to get into this podcasting game. So
ditto. Them and Wayne Henderson for me.
Yes.
Well, all right. What episode are we talking about tonight?
We are talking about infection.
Right. And let's just go straight to your summary and find out what happened in this show.
All righty then.
Archive. Access. Initiated.
While working in MedLab, Dr. Franklin receives a surprise visit from Dr. Vance Hendricks, a former teacher of Franklin's that offers him the adventure of a lifetime. Hendricks doesn't elaborate on the adventure he is offering. Meanwhile, in the station's customs center, a security officer is inspecting cargo that belongs to one Nelson Drake. The arrangement of one of Nelson's cases causes the security man to suspect that he might be trying to smuggle something onto the station. Nelson then attacks and kills the inspector with a handheld device. Soon after, Franklin is called to examine the fallen security man. Franklin determines that the man died from natural causes and is willing to leave it at that. However, Sinclair and Garibaldi insist that he perform an autopsy. Franklin returns to MedLab to visit with Hendricks to discuss the adventure mentioned earlier. Hendricks asks Franklin to help him examine some artifacts that he found on a recent dig on an alien planet. Hendricks then introduces Franklin to his assistant, who turns out to be Nelson Drake. Nelson opens a case containing the artifacts, and at the same time, an energy spike is reported in the command center. Hendricks explains that the artifacts were found on Akara 7, and that his dig was sponsored by a corporation called Interplanetary Expeditions. He then asks Franklin to run a medical scan on the artifacts, and Franklin finds that they are composed of living tissue, a form of organic technology. Franklin is puzzled because the artifacts should have been quarantined before being allowed on the station, and Hendricks lies, telling him that they have been previously quarantined at an earlier stop. He then tries to convince Franklin to join him. Later, Nelson is in his quarters. He opens a case which contains an artifact that fires an energy surge at him, which throws him across the room. In the command center, Sinclair asks Garibaldi if there were any more conclusive results of the autopsy. Garibaldi informs him that it still appears to be natural causes, but the autopsy is not yet complete. Franklin and Hendricks have been spending many hours studying the artifacts. Franklin asks Hendricks what might be the result of their study to find out how the organic technology works. Hendricks explains that it can be sold to an Earth corporation. Franklin isn't happy about that prospect and tells Hendricks that it seems a little like grave robbing and taking a shortcut as opposed to scientific discovery. Franklin also explains that he hasn't been able to find any information on the corporation that funded the dig. Hendricks promises to explain everything the next day. In another part of the MedLab, Nelson notices that he is undergoing some sort of physiological change. Back in his quarters, Nelson takes one of the artifacts out of a case. It appears to be alive. He places it on his chest and begins a dramatic change. Franklin enters MedLab and finds that Nelson has undergone a metamorphosis and has become something not recognizable as human. Nelson points his arm at Franklin and says, "Protect," and then shoots Franklin with an energy discharge. Later, Franklin recovers in the infirmary and informs Sinclair and Garibaldi that Nelson appeared to be using a weapon that resembles the organic technology that Hendricks and he have been studying. Sinclair and Garibaldi ask Franklin if the artifacts were quarantined. Franklin tells him that Hendricks told him that they had been, but he cannot make any guarantees. Meanwhile, Nelson wanders the station. Sinclair confronts Hendricks. Hendricks lies again, telling Sinclair that he was told by Nelson that the artifacts were quarantined. Sinclair tells him that he will be held personally responsible for any incidents resulting from the artifacts being on the station. Hendricks then explains that the artifacts may attach themselves to living beings to achieve mobility, but he cannot explain why that particular one has chosen Nelson. Sinclair authorizes him to do further studies with Franklin. As Sinclair leaves, Nelson has a smirk on his face as though he knows more than he is letting on. Meanwhile, Nelson kills 2 passers-by on a lower level of the station, again saying, "Protect." At the same time, another energy discharge is registered in the command center, but this time it is stronger than the previous one. Garibaldi leads a security team that locates Nelson and confronts him with weapons fire. But Nelson isn't even fazed in the least and continues to move around the station unimpeded. Meanwhile, in MedLab, Franklin and Hendricks continue to study the artifacts. Franklin accidentally finds the device that Nelson used to kill the security man and hides it from Hendricks' view. Sinclair guesses that Nelson must be headed for the central corridor where the majority of the station's population is, and where Nelson can do the most damage. Ivanova informs Sinclair that after each attack, Nelson apparently has to rest for a time, but those intervals are becoming shorter and the energy spikes are becoming increasingly more powerful. Back in MedLab, Franklin accesses the memory banks of the artifacts. As Sinclair heads off to do battle with Nelson, Franklin explains what he has learned. The Akarans were an advanced race that had been invaded by others on numerous occasions. So they invented a living weapon to protect them from invading races. The weapons were given instructions that they were to eliminate any living beings on their world except for those that are pure Akaran. The weapon was successful, but since there were no such thing as pure beings, the weapons then turned on the Akarans themselves and killed all of them. All of the weapons had been deployed save the one that now has control of Nelson, which is carrying out its programming. After destroying the Akaran race, the remaining weapons died off. Sinclair decides to use this information to lead Nelson into an airlock and have him blown out into space. Sinclair finds Nelson and tells him that the entire Akaran race has been destroyed. At first, the weapon doesn't believe what he has been told, but Sinclair tells him to search Nelson's memories. The weapon sees what Nelson saw on Akara and realizes that Sinclair is telling the truth. In a fit of guilt, the weapon asks for his people's forgiveness and rips the artifact from its chest. Nelson is then restored and the artifact is destroyed. Later, Franklin again confronts Hendricks. Franklin explains that the device he found in Nelson's belongings was a cardiac stimulator, and it could have caused a person to have symptoms of a heart attack. He also explains that he found 2 small marks on the security man's body that matched the device. Nelson has confirmed that he was acting under Hendricks' orders. Hendricks says he brought them to Franklin because if they had discovered that they were bioweapons, then he would make a huge profit. Then Hendricks offers to share the profits with Franklin if he doesn't turn him in. But security arrives and takes Hendricks into custody as Franklin has already turned him in. In the aftermath, Garibaldi stops by Sinclair's quarters to confront him about continually putting himself in harm's way. He accuses Sinclair of looking for something worth dying for because it is easier than finding something worth living for. Sinclair reluctantly agrees that Garibaldi might be right. Franklin and Ivanova discuss their disgust of racial purity, referring to anti-alien factions back on Earth. Ivanova expresses hope that people will learn from the past. At that moment, representatives of the Earth Force Bioweapons Division arrive and confiscate the artifacts. In a subplot, Sinclair is scheduled for an interview with a reporter from Interstellar Network News. Sinclair is concerned about this because the last time he granted an interview, he was stationed at a very faraway place for a while. Garibaldi manages to run interference for Sinclair for a bit, but then the reporter gets curious about Garibaldi's story, how his past troubles make Babylon 5 his last chance to make good. The reporter confronts Sinclair in the command center just before the final battle with Nelson and is dismissed promptly. Finally, in the end, the reporter gets her interview and asks Sinclair if humans really belong in space. Sinclair's answer is that in order for human culture to be preserved, people must seek new homes in the stars.
Initiating plot analysis.
Okay, then. All right, Jim. Basic plot summary. Guy gets zapped, sticks big rock on his chest, and goes Megazord. Protect. Oops, my bad.
Oh, no, that covers it pretty well, yes.
This was actually Joe Straczynski's one of his least favorite episodes, I've found out from looking at his. I sort of understand why. I didn't like it at first. It just seemed a little too contrived and too wooden in some ways.
Yeah.
Yet, the more I've watched it, this is an episode that kind of grows on you. At least for me. It kind of grew on me.
Yeah. It wasn't one of my favorite episodes for casual viewing. My deal is, though, if I sit down to watch a series, love it or hate it, I'm going to watch every episode.
Yes.
And this wasn't one of my favorites, but on a closer look, some of the things did present themselves that deserve more scrutiny, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it is a mythology episode. It sets in place, it introduces some very important parts of the mythology. And, another thing to note, in Joe Straczynski can be hard on himself if he feels he's let the quality slide. Mm-hmm. Even though it's not my favorite Babylon 5 episode, that doesn't mean it's not a good episode.
Right.
At least in my opinion. But this was also the first script he produced for the series after the pilot.
Yes.
So he was still getting back into everything.
Mm-hmm.
About the series itself, or about the episode itself, we had actually 3 guest stars in here. The obvious one that we see first is the reporter gal, and she's not credited. I couldn't find a credit for her.
Oh, yeah, I haven't searched for that. I'm sure we could find out somehow, but
hopefully one of our listeners will know something about it and might be able to send it in to us. We also had, as far as guest stars, Vance Hendricks, or Dr. Vance Hendricks, who was played by David McCullum, and his assistant, Nelson Drake, played by Marshall Teague.
And I understand Marshall comes back in a few episodes, only as another species.
Yeah, this is one of the few times we actually see the man without a Narn mask. And according to my wife, that's a bit of a disappointment because, as she put it, he is, quote, unquote, a total babe.
Well, we won't find my wife's total babe until the 3rd season.
Well, she'll say the same thing about him, too.
Ah.
Oh, golly. Yes, sir.
So anyway, David McCallum, we recognize him from an older TV series. He was quite a bit younger, The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Yep.
And where else have we seen Marshall Teague?
bear in mind, I'm a terrible person with names. I only connect him to Babylon 5, but the face does look familiar.
Ah, IMDb. Our friend.
Marshall R. Teague. I thought he was...
Yep, I got
it. The Rock, Armageddon, Roadhouse.
Okay, I saw Armageddon, but I don't remember what part he played on that.
American Heiress. Guest roles on Walker, Texas Ranger, the TV movie. A little soap opera work with Bold and the Beautiful. Regular on in and out guest star on Walker, Texas Rangers, the series as well. So definitely, he kept himself busy.
He was on
Appearances on Sliders,
Voyager.
DS9, on the episode Hippocratic Oath as Timo Zuma.
Quantum Leap.
Yep, the guy definitely keeps busy.
So he's
which
been
is
around.
Good. Which is good. He's a great actor.
Yes.
In Babylon 5, he plays Talon, I thought.
Yes, I believe that's right. He's the swordman. That's down the road a little bit.
Absolutely one of my favorite Narn characters, other than, in addition to Jakar.
Yes.
Okay, you had said you weren't as fond of this episode as far as some of the others, but like we said, it introduced a lot of the basic mythology. What were the key points of that mythology that you saw come in?
Okay, well, for me, I believe it gave us quite a bit of background on Franklin and fleshed him out a little bit. He was, at this point, a new character. We learned that he studied xenoarchaeology. We found that he was not corruptible, and we found out that he is able to ferret out answers to some difficult questions.
And he's driven.
Yes.
He's driven. All of those actually are really great character values to have.
Yes.
But when you don't have the discipline needed to go with those, they can get you in trouble. And we'll be seeing that along his character's journey.
Yeah. Later on, down the road, he gets himself into a little bit of trouble. Then we get some insight into biotechnology in this episode. At least we find out that the Vorlons and the Minbari both have biotechnology.
Or as they phrase it more in the show, it's organic technology. They'll call it organic technology.
Right. Some weapons companies would like to develop, Earth weapons companies would like to develop the organic technology, and EarthGov is very interested in having it. Which
brings to point one of the areas that, for me, was one of the key mythology elements of this story, interplanetary expeditions, IPX. Because, as Franklin discovers, there's no record of the company. And basically, IPX is a front for Earth Force's New Technologies Division, and it's a bioweapons supplier.
Yes. And Dr. Hendricks knew this going in.
Yes, he did. And even knowing that, he still tried to cheat them for more money.
He was going to sell it to the highest bidder. And Dr. Franklin called him out on that because he wasn't doing pure research for research's sake. He was looking to profit from his findings.
Exactly. And, I kind of wonder what happened to Vance after IPX and Earth Force got hold of him. I mean, the guy, he either disappeared into some deep, dark hole, breathing or not, or he got one heck of a big promotion. And I have no idea which.
Oh, I would imagine he's probably was sent back out and told just to stay away from Babylon 5.
Yeah.
That seems to be the way that EarthGov operates.
Seems to be sometimes. I do know this. This is not the last we're going to hear from IPX. Not by a long shot, though, as in this case, they always seem to be this shadowy organization in the background. Because remember, it's IPX that was responsible for the mission to Zahadum. Yes. They're also responsible for some of the development of certain new Earth Force ships we'll see later in the show. So, anyway, Vance has discovered this organic technology, and my little comment about going Megazord, it seems it grafts itself into another life form.
Yes. Well, according to the research they were doing, in order for this life form to be able to get up and move around, it had to do this.
Right.
So it would graft itself onto a life form, and in the case of Marshall Teague's character, Nelson Drake, it also began to alter his physiology.
Basically, it was genetically programmed to rewrite the DNA. And, at the time, that seemed a little bit far-fetched. And I guess the rewriting process was still going on. That I would assume that, or better yet, maybe I should say I would presume that has a connection with the weight while he's ramping up to full power. But at the time, that struck me as a little bit lame. But of course, that was before the Human Genome Project results came out, and it was before the extent to which we knew DNA essentially is a programming language. I mean, in my formal biology studies, I've seen, transcription RNA, memory RNA, the way it works, but the degree of association with biomechanical machinery that DNA really is, and I think that might have been one of the reasons why I've liked this show more as it progressed, is that DNA aspect of it is suddenly more feasible.
Well, this episode struck me as when I first saw it, and the first several times I saw it until this last time that I watched it to analyze it for our discussion, it was hokey. Science fiction.
Well, the suit was certainly a little hokey. Science
fiction is science fiction, okay? And this seemed to me more like a monster episode.
that was you kind of hit the old Monster of the Day stuff, which was kind of my Power Ranger reference.
And it was just a monster running around the station. Other shows have done this. I didn't care for those either, but on watching this closer, what I came up with, I have a better appreciation for it.
I definitely understand that. And as contrived as the Monster of the Day motif was, even when Babylon 5 takes a shallow approach, it's got some serious deep points to it to ponder. Because the whole basis of this Monster of the Day, it turned out that the programming that we were talking about overwriting, its program was based on ideological purity. Or as Sinclair asks, what is pure?
Yes.
And that kind of touches on that whole master race fallacy that the Nazis like to promulgate. And that still rears its ugly head.
Yeah, and this is a point that I've been looking forward to discussing with you. Okay, the Icarans, it was told to destroy anything that wasn't pure Icaran. All right, so let's say we had something like this on Earth. Destroy everything that isn't pure human. How else could we have anything other than pure humans on our planet, since there are no other species?
You're thinking in terms of physiology, in terms of biology. You're not thinking in terms of ideology.
Right.
And that was the basis of the programming. The programming of what was human was based on ideological motives.
Okay.
In other words, if the Icarans were the Nazis, the Jews would be programmed to be, as far as this program was concerned, not human. African would be not human. I'm Mexican, a lot of Indian blood. I would be classed as non-human. Only your blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans would be considered human.
I see. However,
nothing would be able to live up to that ideology, or that ideological definition. I mean, it wouldn't be possible to live up to it if you wrote it tight enough. Everything's going to have some sort of flaw that deviates just by the virtue of us being individuals. Yeah. And I think that was Joe's point.
But we're talking about nationalities as far as the humans are concerned. Okay,
or ethnicities.
This machine that they created destroyed the entire race. There are no Icarans left.
Correct. Who is the founder of the Nazi movement in Germany? Or the leader of the Nazi movement in Germany? Right. Adolf Hitler. When you look at his definition of the ideal Aryan, which obviously he seemed to consider himself part of, I don't think he had blonde hair or blue eyes.
No, he didn't fit that at all. He didn't fit his own Aryan ideal.
I don't think any single individual would fit that ideal across every single parameter. And when you're talking about a computer program, if then else, if then else, if then else, that else on every one of those ifs is else kill it, else kill it. Sooner or later, you're going to hit one of the things that says, kill you.
I see. Well, it's probably a good thing we can't create weapons like this.
Yes. Not that I don't think there's a few governments out there that would try.
I'm sure there are.
But, one of the quotes in the story, this was from Sinclair. And, in a way, this was sort of one of my dislikes of the episode is, what really stopped the thing. This was sort of that my bad. Is what really stopped it was death by monologue, almost. When he more or less talked it to death. But one of the things that Sinclair said in that, I think, was very wise. He talks about the first rule of the fanatic. When you become obsessed with the enemy, you become the enemy. And that's one of those timeless messages, I think, about the human condition. So from that perspective, I see where he was coming from.
Yeah. Well, this was definitely a Sinclair going out on his own, the Maverick, once again putting himself in harm's way, which just reaffirms his personality that has been established over the first episodes that we've seen.
Which is a bit of a problem. And one of the things that we're reminded of in this is that Garibaldi and Sinclair go way back far enough that Garibaldi feels he has the right to call Sinclair on the carpet for this. And that's exactly what they talk about near the end of the episode, because Garibaldi's a little put out.
Yes, he is. He cares a great deal about Sinclair and his friendship, possibly because Sinclair has given him his last shot at redeeming himself. For whatever reason, he's been fired from 5 previous jobs, which reasons we haven't been told yet, but we'll find out a lot. One of his major problems a little later on, a few episodes down the road. But, the funny thing is Sinclair got a little bit angry with Garibaldi, but in the end wound up agreeing with him that, you might be right. He says Garibaldi told him, you are looking for something to die for because you're afraid to find something to live for. Yeah.
Exactly. And like Sinclair comments in this, he doesn't know how to feel it now. Not since the Ithmenbari War. And that's even without the 24 hours missing from his mind. To be there in space, as vast as it is, and watching your world, literally your world, being destroyed around you, that's going to be post-traumatic stress syndrome to the nth degree. I mean, far more than anything I can imagine. Well, yeah,
especially when he has a hole in his mind and he didn't put it there.
Right.
Because eventually, even with PTSD, these memories do come back. Sometimes with a vengeance. And there is a hole in his mind. There is a missing 24 hours.
And even the memories coming back. Okay, I've got personal experience with some of this, and I know she doesn't mind me discussing it. My wife has had a problem with copper toxicity, basically metal poisoning. And she's been able to get it treated. In her case, it's a genetic issue, but there's some holes in her memory. There's some parts missing from there. And it can be very, very stressful for her. Especially when everyone around remembers everything, remembers what happened, and she's like, I did that? So, yeah, I can easily understand. Yes. I can easily understand where Sinclair's coming from. Well, even
then, you can help her rebuild those memories, okay? Whereas nobody can help Sinclair except for the people who grabbed him, one of which is on the station and isn't going to tell him anything.
Well, I find the holes get filled in for him.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, in just a few episodes, the hole is going to get filled in huge.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yes.
it is. Any other big issues to bring up on this, on the main story? Because there are some very worthwhile parts of the second story that we want to
Yes.
bring up.
Oh, let's see, IPX. We kind of covered it, haven't we?
I know one part of the secondary story that really is worth mentioning, and it's more of a passing part, is the Narn and Centauri are still busy in negotiations. Again, a lot of times we don't always find out what they're negotiating over. We do know that it's territorial. So what's important here, this is just little crumbs dropped along the way that will develop much more fully through the second season, is they're still focusing on a peaceful solution. They don't want it to go... neither side really wants it to become a shooting war.
Well, they've had a shooting war for so long, they probably can't afford to sustain it. I mean, look at the Centauri already have been reduced to being buffoonish at this point, and the Narn don't seem to really have any teeth.
Yeah.
They've fought themselves to a stalemate, and their negotiations sure don't seem to get them anywhere.
And anyone who knows even a basic background of the story knows that that's not the case for most of the series. No. So there's going to be some stuff happening, and again, should be seeing that person fairly soon. That's going to set the things in motion. And it's amazing how easily a nudge in the right place here or there can push things into an all-out, war.
Well, these two races absolutely hate each other. The Narn attack a station. Supposedly, the Centauri people on this station are going to align themselves with the Narn, but they actually aren't. It's a hot war all the way through that just happens to be taking a respite right now.
And it becomes a key element of the story.
And I don't think it would be as peaceful between those two races as it is if it weren't for the two particular characters involved.
Meaning Londo and Jakar?
Because Londo is busy. I think he's worried about the image of the Centauri Republic. And
he wants to reclaim the old glory days.
And Jakar is looking for ways to get in through the back door. The direct approach is not working. And I think at this point also...
That and revenge.
And the Centauri are obviously quite a bit more powerful than the Narn are.
Though, as Kosh has said, they are both dying people.
Well, as far as Kosh is concerned, everybody's dying people. When you live forever...
Well, Vorlons can be killed.
Well, yes.
Okay, now, there was another element, secondary story. There was another B story. Right that way. There was another B story. We had a reporter on the station doing a story on Babylon 5 because it is now into its second year, and no one thought it would make it online or even past its first year. Now they're going into the second year. And by the way, that also provides some continuity from the pilot movie as well. So that's sort of the secondary story. And in this, we have Sinclair doing everything in his power to avoid the interview that the lady was there to provide.
Yeah.
In fact, Garibaldi's role in the story, except for that part at the end dressing down Sinclair, seems to be running interference to keep the reporter out of his hair. Are you doing a name search?
I am.
I know. I knew you, Jim.
Because I want to find out who this reporter is. Because I heard that our Ozfest convention up here is going to have a Babylon 5 actress showing up. And I want to see if this is...
Patricia Healy.
Oh, okay.
It's buried, but I found it. It's Patricia Healy.
Okay. Well, then... Okay, I guess maybe that's not who it is. Keep looking. We got a Maggie Egan coming.
She plays Marianne Kramer. That's the name of the... And she will be back in another episode as well.
Yes. Okay.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Jim. Okay, so we did a lot, folks. If there is a weird break in the flow of the podcast, we just couldn't take it any longer, and we had to go and search out who played the reporter.
And
the character's name was Kramer.
And a drum roll, please. Who played Kramer?
You get the honors, my friend.
Well, you just told me and I forgot. I didn't write it down.
All right. Marianne Kramer.
Yeah, okay.
Marianne Kramer. And she's back for another episode as well.
She plays a reporter again in that episode, doesn't she? Or am I thinking of something else?
No, I believe so.
Is she the one that comes back on when EarthGov changes hands again and the Interstellar?
No, this will be mid-season by any means necessary. Okay. That's when the dock workers go on strike.
Okay.
All right, but it's actually rather amusing because Garibaldi's flirting with her the whole time.
Yeah, who isn't Garibaldi flirting with?
Who isn't? Yeah, but and I love the way she kind of keeps putting him off. That's why we find out he's had the 5 jobs. How he's been fired.
Actually, the way I saw it is Garibaldi is running interference for Sinclair, and he just keeps blowing her off, and finally she's had enough, and she comes back and says, "Can I ask you some questions?" And she asks, and Garibaldi's like, "Okay, I'm out of here now."
Yep, no comment. You got it. It provides a little comedic relief.
Yes.
Sinclair, apparently, last time he was a participant in an interview, it didn't go very well. The claim is by him that he doesn't interview well, and he got, shall we say, demoted and posted out about as far away as possible.
Yeah, the what would you call it? The Earth Force equivalent of a stint in Alaska.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Though I will say they do get to the final interview, and I'll be honest, this is one of the parts that for me meant a lot out of this episode. And his final commentary when she talks about why are we here, that is what really at the end of the day sold the episode for me. She asks him, is it worth it? Should we just pull back, forget the whole thing as a bad idea, and take care of our problems at home? And Sinclair says, no, we have to stay here, and here's the simple reason why. Ask 10 different scientists about the environment, population control, genetics, and you'll get 10 different answers. But there's one thing every scientist on the planet agrees on. Whether it happens in 100 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, eventually our sun will grow cold and go out. When that happens, it will just take us. It'll take Marilyn Monroe and Lao Tzu and Einstein and Amaro Buddha and Buddy Holly and Astrophanes, and all of this was for nothing unless we go to the stars. Mm-hmm. For me, that is just a very, very powerful statement. It kind of hits to the core of who I am.
Well, and I agree with you, because many times I have thought about this as I continue through my studies to achieve my music degrees. Mozart, there will, if we don't move on somehow, Mozart's gone. Beethoven's gone. They're all gone. Mozart has been alive for over 200 years, through his work. He will never die, but if our civilization comes to an end, it's gone.
That beauty is gone forever.
Never can be retrieved.
One of the ways I used to, and still do sometimes, put it to Anthea. For those of you who don't know, she's a musician and a music teacher, plays bassoon. And for those of you who don't know yet, I'm a scientist and an engineer. primarily work in medical device, medical research. And the way I've described it to Anthea is if it wasn't for what she does as a profession, none of what I do would make a difference.
Well, and you remember Mr. Holland's Opus, I assume.
Yes, I do. There were a lot of people that said that. There's a lot of friends that said that movie was about Anthea.
Mm-hmm. If we do away with music and art and all those other things, then what will the students have to read and write about, in essence?
Yes. And you notice Sinclair's comment was, the examples he pulled out tended to be of the arts. Yeah, he had Einstein in there. But the kind of physics and math, and I'm familiar with that kind of work from my background. I mean, that when you're dealing with things like that, when you're dealing with starting a heart up when it stops, like it becomes an art. There is an artistic side to that, and that's one of the reasons why I get one of the things that truly frosts me is when I hear people talk about, no, we shouldn't be exploring, we shouldn't be going out there and discovering. We should worry about what's here first. This might sound extreme to some people, but for me, it's almost a crime against humanity.
Oh.
And a lot of it has to do with the reasons that you said.
Yes. Well, we need to advance. We need to move forward. And our country has always been a leader in this. And we're kind of taking a back seat lately.
Which really bothers me. And, if you want to go into the practical side of it, there is a practical side of it. When you look at the innovation and the discoveries and how life has been improved by doing what we need to do to explore. I mean, medicine and healthcare, so many of the advances in how to take care of, how to monitor, how to diagnose, and how to treat patients. I know firsthand. I mean, one of the companies that I used to work for, they invented a lot of the early ECG monitoring equipment. One of the earliest defibrillators. It was called Delmar Avionics. One of the other main monitoring diagnostic systems is called Space Labs.
Yep.
Computing technology, food technology, food
and that's all
preservation.
huge.
All from our exploration.
And it goes all the way down to something just as simple as Velcro.
Yeah. What would the world be without Velcro?
The Apollo program.
As long as you keep it out of a pure oxygen environment, it's great.
Yes. The Apollo program was incredible. It was a political thing from the start. We have got to get to the moon before the Russians do. Okay? But look at all the good that came from it.
Yeah. And think about the good that would come from trying to get to Mars. When you look at the challenges that we would have to overcome to get to Mars, and imagine, take it in your wildest dreams as far as imagining how those kinds of technologies would have to be developed, but also how they would be able to help us here on our planet.
And I realize we're getting off on a huge tangent here, but I think finally we're starting to get things right, especially when we look at the.
Actually, they can't see me nodding. Yes, I do. So I'll say yes.
The privatization of space travel, SpaceX, Orbital, companies like that are
Virgin,
that are going to take over the low Earth orbit stuff and free up NASA to look farther.
I really hope that's what happens. And I've got to disagree with you on one thing. I don't think we're going too far afield, because with the kind of emphasis that Straczynski put in those last lines, I think that was part of his point. And pulling IPX into it was also a warning.
So MJS, if you're listening, this episode was not a throwaway episode at all. There was a lot to it.
Not at all. I know I enjoyed it. I know a lot of fans enjoyed it. Okay, I've got to turn to a lighter side here. I know we've talked this episode off really heavily. I've got my Ivanova quotes, and it's kind of a tie for me. One was her comment that it would seem that no one reads Santillana anymore. Bad paraphrase. Those who forget history don't repeat it. And the other one, since we were talking about Kramer, and this is what popped it to my mind, was, don't. You are too young to experience that much pain.
Yes.
This was when the reporter was trying to push her way into Sinclair.
Yeah, when she was already thrown out of the command center.
Mm-hmm.
And she backed down really quick.
I wouldn't stand up to Ivanova.
No, not even a little bit.
You know, there is a little on Claudia Christian's Facebook page. There's a little caption picture of her from a movie that she was doing that has the quote, Claudia Christian's so badass that even when she plays a hooker, she accessorizes it with a Mossberg 500.
That's one I haven't seen.
I'll have to look. I may have actually shared it. You might want to look back through on my Facebook page for that. But I'm sure it's on her. I'm sure it's on her. I'm sure it's on her Facebook page as well.
And I'll tell you what, to our listeners, if you are not following Claudia Christian on Facebook, you have no clue what you're missing. Yes, she is. She's hilarious.
All right, my friend. We have talked this one through, I think. Is there anything else that you would like to add as far as likes or dislikes or things that stood out for you?
No, as I said, I gained an appreciation for this episode as I watched it closer.
It stands the test of time.
So did you have anything that stood out to you that maybe irked you a little bit?
Well, the only other irk that, and it's a little nitpick, was, like I said, there were some weak spots in how the Monster of the Day thing got carried off and the way it was more or less stopped through death by monologue. But the one thing that kind of annoyed me was that weapon burned through 12 inches of station deck, but Sinclair's flak vest was enough to stop it when it fired at him.
You think maybe it hit on the EarthGov symbol on his chest? And I hadn't thought of that one.
No idea. On the like side, and big question, the big question out of this episode, and at least in the main part of the episode, how high does IPX's influence go? Now, we've discussed that in some of our theories, and obviously we get answers to it as the story progresses, because in a way, that shadowy organization is a big part of the story. But right now the question is, how high does IPX's influence go?
Mm-hmm. Oh, and there was another point you brought up, I noticed in your notes, that we haven't talked about yet. Yes,
really?
And that is at the beginning of the show, Nelson used a device to kill a security officer. And it was
they called it a cardio stimulator. Yes.
But it was a taser.
Yeah, if you looked at it, it was a hand taser.
And I mean, obviously it was a hand taser.
Oh, it's amazing. This is true for TV. This is true for TV in general. I mean, when they need a prop, they'll grab whatever it is that looks like it'll do the job. That kind of fits the image,
which
of it.
Was convenient because it had the electrodes on it, and that's how Franklin discovered that he had been killed with that same particular machine, because the electrodes and the marks on the body were matched up.
Oh, well, Jim, I think that covers us for tonight. Folks, do go ahead and send us your feedback. We will take your voicemails and your emails, and we will use them for a feedback episode that will slip in between the journey through the main series.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess until then, we can say no boom today.
Boom tomorrow. There's always a boom.
There's always
tomorrow.
a boom tomorrow. Good night,
Bye
folks.
Podcast terminated. Thank you for listening to the Babylon Project podcast. You can email Raul and Jim at the Babylon Project podcast at gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at the Babylon Project Podcast. On the internet, we are at babylonprojectpodcast.wordpress.com. To subscribe to the podcast, you can find us on iTunes, or you can subscribe to the RSS feed on the webpage.